All right. How about now?
Yes, we can see this.
Yes. Awesome. So, the goal is to, over the next 3 weeks, develop competency in survey design. So the idea is from week 1 to week 3, we'll develop proficiency in how do you design a survey from a very high level. How do you conceptualize the design of a survey? How do you implement it? And then when you've done it, how then do you use the data to drive policy and to drive insight? So that will be the high level map we would follow for the next 3 weeks. For today's lecture, however, we want to focus on the basics, the foundational elements. So we'll be talking about basic sampling methods. And before we even key into that, we would like to look at some housekeeping rules that have already been announced, but this will be recorded and the slides we shared afterwards so that we are. So for today's session, we'll cover some key definitional aspects and concepts. We'll talk about simple random sampling. We'll discuss stratified random sampling and elements of cluster and systematic sampling. Those are some of the things we'll cover today and then into next week as well. So, but before we even go into that, let's take a step back and talk about why do we need to gain expertise in survey design? That is something important that we need to cover upfront to understand, to get some motivation for why the lecture series, oh, sorry, I'm having some videos with my issues with my video, on why we need to focus on this. So there are many reasons why we might want to pay attention to a course on survey. For one, I think common things occur commonly. One of my criticisms of how we teach epidemiology in graduate school has always been that we tend to focus too much on clinical studies. So a traditional curriculum for, let's say, a master's degree in science will teach you everything about design of clinical trials and design of case control studies. But the reality is that in your career, you're more likely to conduct a survey than to conduct a clinical trial, right? So if the premise is that common things occur commonly, then we need to build expertise in the things that are pretty common. So that's the argument for one. And then secondly, for the purpose of job flexibility, it's a very, very important skill set to have in terms of the design of surveys. Especially for those of us who are interested in working with international organizations like WHO or UNICEF or CDC, those skills are extremely, extremely important. So if you take a quick look at, so let's look at, for example, job postings by WHO. There's hardly a job posting that will not require you having some expertise in the design of surveys, right? So let's say you are looking for, let's say these are some of the jobs currently. I'm searching under the theme of surveillance, because obviously most of what WHO or CDC does is surveillance. Like I said, the argument is that there is hardly a role that you would want to fill that will not require expertise in survey design. So let's say we want to pick a random role here. Let's say coordinator for polio eradication. And that will apply to any role we pick here, by the way, right? So let's say coordinator for polio eradication and EPI. If you look at the description of duties, you see that many of those things there have to do, you see words like surveillance and data and surveys, and all of those things are things that require expertise in survey design, right? So the end point is that as much as you want to work in an international organization, you absolutely need to develop expertise in the design and the conduct of surveys. So it's not just implementing them, but how about the design, right from the word go, making sure that you're designing them in a way that they are valid. That's also very, very important. Now, you might also say, okay, well, I don't want to work in an international organization. I just want to start up my own shop and let's run my own business. Well, if you're also going to do the business of research, there is no way you'll avoid doing surveys. This is what we do, in Chisquares, large companies like biotech companies or pharmaceutical companies, they need surveys. Why? Well, because at the end of the day, when you have created a drug, you want to demonstrate value for the drug. You want to create what we call a global value dossier, which is a big document that tells, ministries of health or people who have to buy the drugs, like insurance agencies, why it's so important. And we get those perspectives from surveys, right? And so it becomes extremely important for us to understand the basics of survey design, right? Not just because we want to do a small survey on Google Forms, but because it's a career-changing move. So that just sets the stage for why we want to pay attention to issues regarding survey design. And in general, throughout the course of this lecture, when we talk about survey design, we are not referring simply to, we're not referring simply to just a quick and dirty survey where you just gather a bunch of questions and administer on Google Forms. We're talking more about complex surveys. So that sets the stage for what to expect over the next few weeks, right? Next 2 weeks. We're talking specifically about the design of complex surveys. Now, when we talk about complex surveys, we mean surveys that involve unequal selection probabilities. So again, we'll cover more of that in weeks 2 and weeks 3. So if you really want to get a comprehensive understanding of the subject matter, it will be really important for you to attend all 3, because the lectures are designed in such a way that each builds on the previous one, so that we have, a cascade of knowledge. All right, so that sets the stage for why it's important for us to understand surveys. We're going to share a document here with you that has, some homework, and so homeworks are expected. It's encouraged that you practice them so that it solidifies what we have learned in each week, so that as we go to the next week, you have practiced, and as I say, practice makes good. So that will be the expectation for the class. Oops, sorry, my video is off. I didn't realize that. Okay. The expectation is that we will provide the homework, and then you will practice, and so that it builds on what we have covered, in the current class. So that's the expectations for the class. Of course, this is not, there are no credits for this. This is not a university class, so there are no credits. So, but again, the point is practical learning, hands-on learning over the next 2 weeks. All right, that sets the stage for the class. Now let's move on to our material for today. Want to understand, first of all, some key definitions and concepts so that we're all on the same page in terms of survey design. Now, for us to become very good experts at survey design, we need to acknowledge that survey design is both a science and an art. So it's a science because obviously it follows scientific principles. We're always worried about 2 things, validity and precision. So that's the scientific part. But it's also an art. It's no different from any other art form like singing or dancing. Everybody brings their own flair to it, right? And the more experienced you are in the field, the more you become very good at breaking rules. You can decide that, oh, okay, this is how I want to do things. That's how I want to do things. So it's both a science and an art form. So that's something we need to really cement on. What we really want to discourage is the perspective where we look at things at the framework of right or wrong. That's a very simplistic way of looking at things in general. So when you look at the survey design that somebody has put forward, it's not very helpful to say, oh, that's wrong. Well, you could say, oh, well, we could design it a different way, right? Because it's very hard to say a survey design is wrong, right? The question is, does it fit the context? Does it answer the question that was originally set before it? So that's one thing I really want to cement in, that it is both a science and an art. And so you will have your own preferences. If you bring in 10 survey experts to design a study, you might have 10 different designs, and that's completely fine because there's an art form to it and it is a science as well. When we're designing surveys, there are 3 key things we need to worry about. Now, again, like I said, these lectures will be from a very, very practical perspective. So practically, there are 3 things you need to worry about when designing surveys. And again, we're assuming that the surveys are designed to be representative of the region you're trying to survey. The first thing, of course, as scientists, is to worry about validity. Validity simply means truth. So we want to get the truth of whatever we're trying to measure. So that is important. So internal validity, external validity. Internal validity means truth within the study, right? Are we measuring things the right way? is what we're measuring, what we think we're measuring. All of these things are concerned with internal validity. So when we talk about internal validity, we're specifically referring to the three biases in epidemiology: confounding bias, measurement bias, and selection bias. Those are things we worry about in internal validity. Now, external validity talks about generalizability of a study from our sample to the broader population. So we want to make sure that, there's internal and external validity. Now, do we always need external validity? No. It depends on what the study is all about. So let's say a company comes or a government comes and asks you, oh, Mr. Expert, we want you to design a survey for us. Don't just jump in and say, all right, let's start. No, you have to ask some questions, right? An expert is, expertise by the kind of questions the person will ask at the beginning. They will ask questions like, oh, so what are you trying to use this survey for? What is the purpose of the survey, right? Are you trying to generalize data across the whole country, or are you just trying to understand behaviors of this group, right? That is trying to get at whether you need to worry about generalizability, right? And the rule is simple. Don't worry about things you don't have to worry about. If you don't have to worry about external validity, don't worry about external validity, right? Don't be that guy with the hammer to whom everything is a nail, right? Just worry about what the survey is designed to do. A very bad practice in survey is to say, we are going to collect data today for all of the needs for tomorrow and next tomorrow and next few years. No, that's bad because it makes your survey become so very large and burdensome. Just worry about the needs that are there for today, right? Even the Lord's Prayer says, give us our bread for today, right? That is the same model we want to carry along in survey design. Don't worry about, oh, we want to capture needs for 10 years to come. Well, when those needs come, we'll just design another survey at that time. So worry about the needs for today so that the survey doesn't become burdensome. Then we need to worry about issues of precision. So bucket number one is issues of validity, which is truth. The second issue is issue of precision. Precision means sample size. So that means that when we're conducting surveys, obviously, we need to make sure we have a large enough sample size to ensure that our results are precise. The third thing you need to worry about is the budget or the cost for the study. I can design a survey for $0, but I can also design a survey for $100 million, right? It all depends on what is going to get into that survey. So if you are asked to design a survey for an agency or an entity or a government or an institution, you need to understand what their budget is. You absolutely need to, right? So how much, you have to ask them, so how much were you thinking? What's your budget, right? And the things you need to consider in that budget will include things like incentives, and it will include things like, let me show you an actual budget for a survey, just to cement some of those things in. Let me see if I can pull a budget for a study. Hold on a minute. So you need to ask all of those things up front, because those things will directly impact, how do I exit full mode now? All right. So this is the budget for a survey. This was a study from a pharmaceutical company looking at, patients' concerns about genital herpes in a few countries. Just to highlight some of the things that you must keep in mind when you're budgeting for surveys, right? Because cost is something that, as scientists, we're not brought up to think about issues of costs. We think about the issues of science, but money makes the world go round. You can have the best of intentions and the best of science, but at the end of the day, you need to be able to deliver based on budgetary issues. So these are some of the things that you need to worry about in terms of design. Now, sometimes you also have to worry about, like in this case, maybe this is not a very good example because this study was pre-launch. This company was in the phase 2 clinical trial, and so they did not know what the outcome of that trial would be. So the goal was, let's just do a small survey, and then when the results of the phase 2 trial comes out, we'll decide whether we'll go ahead with the survey or not. So all of these pricings were for pre-launch. So in other words, all of the activities we will need to take before we actually launch the survey. It does not count for things involved in actually launching the survey. So all of these activities are pre-launch costs. But even the pre-launch costs, you have to worry about, okay, project management, right? You have to worry about the development of a questionnaire and the translation of a questionnaire and cognitive testing. When you develop a questionnaire, obviously you have to test it. If you are involving people, you have to pay them for their time, right? Because, well, their time is money. So all of those translate into direct costs. The coding of a survey, the hosting of a survey, development of a protocol, development of a statistical analysis plan. You have to plan for IRB review and quality assurance processes. All of those things are serious costs, right? So this is just even for a pre-launch survey where we are not just talking about the costs before we launch the survey. You can see that we have racked up quite a series of costs here. So just for pre-launch, we've not even launched the survey yet. The cost of the survey is already £514,000, right? And we have not talked about a single dollar or cent for actual collecting the data yet. This is just the cost that we need to put in place to prepare for the launch of the study, right? So the point I'm trying to make is that a surveys are expensive, right? Especially when they're large surveys that we're doing, international surveys, they easily become, cost in the millions of dollars or millions of pounds, right? So you will be a really terrible designer if you're not fully aware of budgets. This is extremely important, especially when you're now doing work for clients. The last thing you want to do is to give a budget and then you just realize midstream that, oops, this money is not enough. You have to go back. That calls into question your expertise. If you're such an expert, how did you not know that this is what will be required to do the study, right? So your expertise is not only in the issues of validity or issues of precision. Your expertise should also be in the real-world issues, the logistics. Budgets are issues of logistics that you need to be familiar with. You need to know what it costs to do surveys, right? Or large-scale studies in general. So those are the three things you need to worry about: the issues of science, the issues of precision, and the issues of budgets and logistics, because that's equally important as well. So when we do surveys, especially large, complex surveys, we always need to balance issues of cost and issues of precision. And this is where you have to manage the expectations of your clients or the agency you're working with. Companies or governments will tell you, oh, yeah, we want to stratify by age, sex, race, gender. And then you're like, okay, but are you aware that these things have cost implications? Don't be the guy who just says yes to everything, because that's dangerous. Because when you're talking about, oh, we want to do this, and this, you should be aware that there are dollars attached to those things. So it's your job to manage the expectations of the clients or the company or the government, whatever the entity it is that you're developing a study for them. They need to be aware that these things come with huge dollar signs attached to them, and that, money is what makes the world go round. So as you are saying, oh, we want to have a very high level of precision, we want to stratify by all these variables, they should be aware, or even you should be aware, that these things come with huge costs that somebody has to pay for them. There's no such thing as a free lunch in this world. Everything is paid for by somebody. The fact that you're getting it free doesn't mean it's free. Somebody is paying for it, right? So we need to be aware of that. And so it's your job, when you are the one designing studies for clients, whether they're governments or countries or companies, it is your job to communicate this slide very well so that you manage expectations. And that's very important, because you don't want to wait till the end, and then you have disgruntled clients who are not happy because what they've gotten is not what they thought they will get, because you fail to manage expectations in clearly communicating that these things are expensive. And so for the budget you have, this is what we can deliver. Now, if you want to expand the scope of the work, well, we can expand the scope, but we'll have to pay more. There will have to be some trade-offs in terms of costs versus precision. Those are things that you have to learn and you have to manage along the journey of study design. Now, again, one of the things you have to be very clear is understanding what is the intention. What is your intent? You need to understand that from the client's perspective. It's not so much about your perspective. What do you want to do with the data? If the goal is to generate estimates that are representative, if the goal is to generalize the results, then that means that you must draw a representative sample. Sampling must be at random. Now, why do you have to sample? Well, there are two ways of tasting the soup. You can drink the entire pot, or you can take a scoop, right? Well, sampling says that, well, we don't have to drink the entire pot to understand what's happening. We can just take a sample. And this is something that non-scientists sometimes struggle with a lot to comprehend. The idea that somehow, even if we took a small sample, it is somehow representative of these millions. Just a few weeks ago, I was having a discussion with one of the top leaders at Airbnb, and they obviously have to take samples. They have a strong quality assurance program, and so they get signals and then they investigate those signals. But the question was, of the samples of the signals that are investigated, how accurate are they doing a job of investigating them to the full and making sure that they're well conducted? So they have millions of records that are investigated. So the idea that somehow we don't need to fetch millions of records before we can answer that question was something that they really struggled to understand. But that's the power of statistics. That's the power of random sampling. Random sampling tells us that even though you have millions upon millions of records, we don't have to take millions upon millions of records before we can answer that question you have. We can just take a small scoop. And statistics assures us that as long as that small scoop is random, then it's good. It will tell us, it will answer that question accurately, and we don't have to go through all of this headache of fetching millions of records, right? But if you want to fetch millions of records, I am more than happy to help you with that. Just be aware that there are cost implications to going through millions of records, right? The more efficient thing is to rely on statistics and probability theory, which assures us that as long as we take just a random sample, we are covered. So again, this is something that, again, most people cannot wrap their head around. The idea that somehow the sample size in the survey does not depend on the size of the population. It's like you want to taste soup from a pot. It doesn't matter whether the pot is this big or this big. The amount of soup you need to take to taste is just small. It doesn't really matter on the size of a pot, as long as you stir the pot very well. Obviously, that's a big assumption. As long as the content of the pot are very well stirred, you can take a random sample. And so that's the idea. As long as we take a random sample of our population, it is fit for use and fit for purpose. And so this is what essentially we're trying to achieve, what we call the cycle of inference. In other words, the population gives us a sample through the process of sampling, and then from a sample, we get inferences, which we apply back to the population, right? This process assumes that this sampling is done at random, and that the estimates, which we then get from the sample, are free of bias, right? So this arrow assumes random selection. This arrow assumes absence of bias, selection, measurement bias and confounding bias. So this, assuming that all of those things are met, then this cycle is maintained. So, like I said, you're talking to the client, you need to understand what is the intent. Because as the expert, it will be ridiculous if you, the expert, are then asking them, so what sampling methods do you want to use? That is not a question for you to ask your client. The question you need to ask them is to understand, what do they want to do with the data? Then you, as the expert, are then supposed to tell them, all right, based on what you have said, here is what we can do, right? So that's how it's supposed to work, because you can't expect the client to now have an understanding of sampling methodology. And so that's your job. So the litmus test is whether there is an intention to create generalizable knowledge. That is what determines what sampling methods we can use. If the goal is to create generalizable knowledge, then we have no other option but to use probability-based sampling methods, right? We call it probability-based or probabilistic because a probability is a number that is calculated from a number at the top divided by a number at the bottom. We call a number at the top the numerator. We call a number at the bottom the denominator. So imagine that we wanted to take a sample from, sorry, there's a lot of ambient noise where I am. Suppose we want to take a sample from all of us who are 230 of us in the class right now. We have all of our names, and then we'll say, okay, we're going to take 50 people. So we have a number at the top, which is 50, and a number at the bottom, which is 230. That means that we can calculate a probability. And that's why it's called probabilistic sampling, because you have a number at the top and you have a number at the bottom, and therefore you can calculate a probability. With non-probabilistic sampling, it's so called because you have a number at the top, but you don't have a number at the bottom. Imagine you dropped a link on, let's say, Instagram or LinkedIn and say, hey, please take the survey. And eventually, at the end of the day, 50 people take the survey. So you have a number at the top, 50. But the question is, what is the number at the bottom? You don't know that number. And because you don't know that number, you can't calculate the probability. And that's why we call the sampling methods non-probabilistic, because you cannot calculate the probability because you only have one number, which is the number at the top. You do not know the denominator, right? And that is why they are called non-probabilistic, because it is impossible mathematically to calculate the probability because you do not know the denominator, as opposed to probabilistic sampling techniques where you know the probability because you know the number at the top and the number at the bottom. So what are some of the probabilistic sampling methods we will cover? Well, the most common ones are simple random. Everybody knows simple random, right? And so simple random means that everybody has an equal and known probability of selection. People typically confuse simple random sampling and probabilistic sampling techniques. Who can share with us, like, what is the distinction between probabilistic sampling techniques and simple random? Because people use those two interchangeably. So we want to make sure that we leave this class very clear of the distinction. Obviously, one is a subset of the other, but what's the difference between the two of them? What is the probabilistic sampling technique? So that we are 100% on the same page as to the difference between the two of them. Who wants to share?
Please raise your hands. Henry?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much. So I'll just share my thoughts on what I think the difference is. Like you've rightly highlighted that simple random sampling is just one of the subset of probability sampling because the numerator and the denominator, that means the sample and the total, the population size is known. So for simple random sampling, you just pick people randomly. You decide how that would be done. However, not all probability sampling will have to be carried out in a way in which we are going to do a simple random sampling. I think those are just my comments. Thank you.
You should never ever mute yourself.
Okay, I think there's some other hands up.
Helen? Riri, can you unmute yourself?
Hello,
Hi.
are you hearing me?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Yeah. Good evening, good morning, everyone. My network is bad, but I can try, yeah. when we talk about probability sampling techniques, it's like a method of selecting a sample from a population where each member has a known and equal chance of being selected. And it encompasses simple random sampling, which is where every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. That's the differences that I wanted to say. Thank you.
All right, thanks. All right, let's interrogate that statement a bit more. You said probability sampling is one where everybody has a known and equal probability of selection.
Of equal chance of being selected.
Okay, yeah, equal chance of being selected.
Yes.
So how many of us agree that that is what probability sampling is? Does everyone have to have an equal selection probability? In other words, does everyone have to have an equal chance of selection for it to be called probability sampling? Yes or no? You can type your answers in the chat, whether it's yes, whether you're on the side of yes, or whether you're on the side of no. If you're on the side of yes, you can give me a thumbs up. If you're on the side of no, you can give me a thumbs down. So the question is very simple. For us to say something is probability sampling, does everyone need to have an equal probability of selection? Yes or no? Thumbs up or thumbs down? Let's see. Okay. We have a bunch of no's, but we have a bunch of yeses too. All right, we need one person from a no camp to defend their opinion, and then we need one person from a yes camp to defend their opinion. So first of all, let's go for the no camp. Who wants to defend that thesis or the statement that no, it does not have to be equal probability for it to be called probability sampling? This is very important. We need to understand this very, very clearly before we understand the whole rest of the lectures, week 2 and week 3. So this is key. So who wants to defend that it does not have to be equal probability for it to be probability?
Elaine, please unmute.
Okay, thank you. I think probability means there is a chance of selection, but it does not mean there is equal point of selection. What I mean is there is a chance of selection, but it does not mean every individual has an equal chance of selection.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other perspective?
Rashid.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hello.
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah. To my understanding, Prof, it is practically impossible to have equal chance of being selected at the same time.
Okay. Thank you. We'll come back to that later. One last opinion. But before we leave that, it is possible, but it's not always possible, right? So that's the point we're trying to make. There are some sampling techniques that will result in equal selection probability, right? For example, what we have here.
The symbol one.
Which ones can give us equal selection probability of what is listed here?
Okay, symbol.
Okay, what else?
Symbol random.
Yes, what else?
I think Prof is only symbol.
Okay. All right, let's take it one after the other. Simple random sampling, will it give us an equal selection probability? Thumbs up or
Yes,
thumbs
Prof.
down? Yes.
Yes.
Simple random will always give you equal selection probability. So this is why we did not accept the last answer that said it is impossible to generate equal selection probabilities. It is possible, right? But it's not with all of them. If you do a simple random sampling, you will always get equal selection probabilities. What of systematic sampling? Will it give us equal selection probabilities? Yes or no?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, the answer is yes, right? Remember, systematic sampling says we're going to start here and jump we're going to talk more about it. We're going to jump every 5th person. So that means the probability of selection is 1/5, and it's consistent for every person, right? So systematic sampling will always also give us equal selection probabilities. All right, this is where it gets, let's now get the tricky waters. What of cluster sampling? Can cluster sampling give us an equal selection probability? Yes or no? Well, whenever the question is complex, what is the only answer that is correct? Whenever a question is complex, what do you think is the answer that will always be correct? Exactly. Somebody says it depends. I love that. That is the only correct answer. You have to become, you have to understand the nuance in there, right? With cluster sampling, it can be equal selection probability, or it can be unequal selection probability, depending on how you design it. Now, this is where you, as the expert, comes into play with your design chops, right? You can say, okay, for this company, or this country, this survey I've been asked to conduct, I really don't want to worry about weights down the line. So I'm going to use cluster sampling, but in a way that does not require weights, right? So I'm going to make this an equal probability cluster sampling. For example, I'm going to do a 2-stage PPS sampling, which will give you equal selection probabilities, right? So depends on how you design it. You can have some cluster samples that are equal selection probabilities. But it's also possible to have cluster sampling that is not equal selection probability. It depends on the design. And you are the one in driver's seat. So this is why it's important for you who is designing the study to know whether it's equal selection probability or not, depending on how you design it. You are the one who will tell us whether it was equal or not equal. And this is important, extremely important, because if it's not equal, then you have to worry about weight. You must create weight. Otherwise, the study is not valid, right? So this is why it's very important for us to understand that distinction here. Then stratified sampling. Is it equal or non-equal?
It may be equal, but it depends how the researcher designed of using the stratify. We have strata, we have stratum. So it depends how you structure your research design.
Excellent. So it depends, right? So with stratified sampling too, the answer is it depends. If we designed, stratification could be proportionate or disproportionate, right? If it's proportionate, then that means that everyone has an equal selection probability. Proportionate simply means, and we're going to talk more about this in weeks 2 and 3, but we're just setting the stage so that when we get there, it's clear to us. Proportionate sampling simply means that we have a sampling fraction which we're applying to all segments of a population. So the sampling fraction could be saying, oh, we want to sample 10% of the population in each stratum, right? So we take that 10%, we apply it to Blacks, we take that same 10%, we apply it to whites, we take that 10%, we apply it to Hispanics, right? Everybody gets 10% each. So it's proportionate. So everybody's probability of selection is 10%, equal selection probability. But I can say, oh, I don't want to design it that way. I actually want to oversample, let's say, minorities, so that I will have a larger sample size from the minorities. So what do? I will say, oh, okay, for whites, I'm going to sample 10%, but for Hispanics, I'm going to sample 20%. And then for blacks, I'm going to sample maybe 25%. Now, suddenly, because of my design, not everybody now has an equal selection probability. Some have 10%, some have 25%, some have 15%. Why? Because I, the investigator, chose to design the study that way. So these decisions are not just dropped from heaven for you. You are the one making the decisions. So that's why it's very important for you to know what's going on, because you will ultimately have to account every decision you make. You know, in Newton's law says for every action, there's a reaction. For every action you take during study design, there's a reaction that you have to take to counteract any negative fallout. So if I introduce a disproportionate sampling, nobody should come to remind, I shouldn't need someone to come and remind me that I have introduced bias into the study and that I have to correct for that bias with weights later on in the design after I've collected my survey, right? That is what expertise means. Expertise means that you know what you're doing and you know that, okay, by just making this decision, I have automatically made this study to be a non-equal selection probability. And by so doing, I have introduced selection bias. And by so doing, I need to do something else to correct for that bias. For example, I need to create weights at the end of the day, right? So it's not waiting for somebody to come and read the paper and say, oh, wow, this person has no idea what they're doing, right? That's not what we want, obviously. We want to make sure that we're in charge of a process from the very beginning to the very end. So the bottom line is that probability sampling can be equal or non-equal selection probability, depending on how you, the investigator, designed it. Some techniques will always be equal probability, like simple random and systematic. Others are, it depends on how we design it. The results can then vary depending on how the design was implemented. In this session, we will not talk so much about non-probability sampling. We would have a different session for that. But the reason why we need to have a very special session is because of this particular sampling technique called capture-recapture. It is an extremely, extremely important technique that anybody who is doing survey design needs to know and really needs to become an expert in. And so because it's so special, we will not just brush it quickly. We will just have to create a special session for non-probability sampling techniques as a different webinar entirely and cover them in detail with a special emphasis on capture-recapture. Because if you're going to do work in outbreak response, if you're going to do work in signal detection, you need to have strong expertise in capture-recapture. So we'll table that as a separate webinar, but it's important just to be aware of it from a very high level that it is a non-probability sampling techniques. Now, non-probability techniques doesn't mean that they are not important. It just means that they're not generalizable. So that means that in our cycle of inference, it stops at the population being studied. We're not trying to generalize beyond that sample to the population. So for a non-probability sampling technique, the inferences do not go from the sample to the population. Rather, it ends right at it goes back to the sample. So we need to understand that. And this is important because when you do your survey and you write your report, you should understand the inference. You should understand the unit of inference that, okay, if it's a probability sampling technique, then the inference goes from the sample to the population. But if it's not, it just stays with the sample. These are some terms we have discussed in the past. But there are two here we need to understand clearly: the parameter and the estimates, which we explained. I don't know how many of you are attended our previous classes, but those were explained in the previous class. Who wants to explain to us the distinction between the parameter and the estimates and between the population and the sample? For those of you who attended our previous class, where we discussed the illustration of the president and his chief of staff. There are four things that you need to be aware of here: the population, the sample, the parameter, and the estimate. Who wants to explain to us? Surely one of you attended our previous classes. No takers?
Jeremiah.
All right, thank you. For the estimates would be the chief of staff statement of the president, because it is the president now that will be the population. So whatever the chief of staff says about the president could be an estimate. So
May I interrupt quickly? Can you set the scene for those who have never heard of it? Can you just set the scene and then fit in the different parts, please?
Okay, I was trying to explain that if you are talking about the sample, the population. So if, for instance, there is a population of the sample you are trying to gather, and you are looking for an estimate, you could not go to the field directly to get the total sample. You only need to get a few of the sample, which could be resulting to the estimate. So the information you gather from the field may not be the generalization of what is actually on ground, but because you got feedback from the field, it could not be termed as estimate. So in this sense, when we say the president and the chief of staff, the president is the population, while the chief of staff represents the estimate of the sample that you are looking for. So whatever this, when the president speaks, you get a full sampling representative. But if you are collecting the statement of the chief of staff, you may not get 100% of what the president actually meant, but it could be an estimate of the president's intention. So excellent. I think that is.
Excellent. So the bottom line is that we have a scenario where you have a president and the president has a chief of staff. You really want to communicate with the president, but nobody just walks into the president and chats with them. So at best, you have to speak to the chief of staff. So in this analogy, there are 4 parameters or 4 things that we need to map. There's the president who is there, the chief of staff. There's what the president says and what his chief of staff says in his behalf. So the president is the population, the chief of staff is the sample. What the president would have said, which we never know because we didn't speak to him, is the parameter, and what the chief of staff said is the estimate, which is what we get from our sample. So this is just a simple way for us to understand how these things map together. We also need to understand population hierarchy when we're designing studies. If you're going to design a national study for a country, you really need to understand how the country is structured, right? The country may be divided into states, and then the states divided into counties. So this should be county, not country. And then each county may be divided into smaller villages or towns, and then you have households. It is your job as the survey design expert to understand that hierarchy. And if you're designing a national survey, ideally, what you should do is you should just go on a random drive through just the country and just understand the layout of the land, right? It's very hard to design a national survey when you're just sitting in an office 3,000 miles away and you've never even been there. You need to get a feel for the country. You need to understand what it is like, right? Because when you're selecting clusters, it needs to make sure it mirrors what is existing on the ground. So all of this is to say that you need to have a deep context of the population that you're trying to study before you can design any studies that are representative. Now, one of the questions you need to ask yourself practically when you're designing a study is, do I have a sampling frame? A sampling frame is a list. Think of this as a sampling frame. I think I have a sampling frame here. Let's go here. So this is a sampling frame, for example. So this is a list of, let's say this is a list of people who work in a hospital, right? So everybody who works in a hospital is in this list. This is what we call a sampling frame. So the first question you ask yourself when you design a survey is, do I have a sampling frame that is what we call the 3 C's: complete, correct, and current? It must meet those 3 parameters. It must be complete. So that means that everybody who works in that hospital must be on this list. If it's not complete, then you end up having issues with non-coverage bias because there are some individuals who are not there. If it's not current, then you also have issues of selection bias because, well, individuals, your sampling frame doesn't capture the current reality. And so the results may not be generalizable. So the first question you always have to ask is, do I have a sampling frame? Or can I create a sampling frame? It's not always that you don't always have a sampling frame. So sometimes you can create it, right? If I'm doing a survey of, let's say, faculty in American universities, do I have a sampling frame? No. Can I create a sampling frame? Yes. I can easily write a Python script that will do web scraping and go to all of the, the university's directories and harvest information on their emails and names from all of them. So I can create a sampling frame in that context, right? So that's the first question you need to ask when you're designing the survey. Do I have a sampling frame? Or if I don't, can I create one? If the answer is no, that means that you cannot use systematic simple random sampling. You can only do simple random sampling when you have a sampling frame. So that's why it's called simple. It's simple because, well, it's simple to execute because we have a sampling frame. Once you don't have a sampling frame, that means that the gods of survey design have already made a choice for you. It means that the only options for you are to use cluster sampling, right? Or to use stratified sampling. And this is the reality when we do national surveys. We don't have a list of everybody who lives in that country, right? So what is the next thing available to us? Well, remember that we said originally that survey design, for it to be valid, there must be a denominator, right? So that means that we need to have a number at the bottom. So you need to have a list of some kind before you can do a random survey. There must be a list. It can either be a list of individuals, which is fine if you can have it, or it can be a list of people or places where people are, right? Which is what we call cluster sampling. Our best bet is to have a list of people, but like they say, when a desirable is not available, the available must be desirable. So if I want to survey people in a country, I'm like, okay, geez, do we have a list of everybody in this country? The answer is obviously no, we don't. All right, so what's the next best thing? The next best thing is, do we have a list of all the places where people can be found? Because ultimately, my goal is to get to those people. So whether I get to them directly or indirectly, to me, it doesn't really matter. So it's either I have a list of all of them, ab initio, or I have a list of where they are, then I can go and find them where they are. And that list of people where they are found is what we call clusters. So it's either you have a list of all the people or a list of all the places where the people can be found. And where can people be found? Well, if they are children, you can find them in schools. If it's a school day, well, guess where all the children are? They're in schools. You can find them in schools. If it's a survey of, let's say, of adults, well, where are adults during a work day? Well, they're at work. So if we can list all the workplaces and sample them, well, we can find the adults in those workplaces, and so on and so forth. So you need to understand your population before you can create a list of the places where they can be found. So in other words, for you to create clusters, you need to really understand the population. You need to say, okay, I would have loved to have a list of all these people, but since I can't get a list of all these people, where do I expect to find them in groups? So it could be schools, it could be households, it could be any other place. It could be churches, it could be religious facilities, it could be markets, right? Wherever people can be found, if we can list all of those places, then we have clusters. That's what clusters are. So the bottom line is that there's no single approach. And so, it's about being flexible in our thought process to make sure that we answer the question originally. Let's quickly describe simple random sample. So it is the simplest method, but we never, ever use simple random sample in large surveys. It is good for use in simple surveys where, okay, if I want to do a survey of everybody here, we can just say, all right, we have 252 people on the call. Let's just take a random sample, and administer the survey. You use it in simple settings where it's convenient and all. Think of the logistical nightmare you would have if you wanted to do a simple random survey as a national survey. For the sake of argument, let's just even assume that you have a list of everybody who lives in the country. Simple random sample will say, oh, go to Utah and sample one person. Then after that, you have to take a flight to Mississippi and sample the next one person. Imagine that it's just going to be a logistical nightmare. This is why we don't use simple random sample. Even if we were to have a list of everybody in the country, we still would not use it because it's a logistical nightmare. It's not convenient. So remember that design of studies is not just about science. You also have to worry about the logistics, right? And that is why we tend to use cluster samples in national surveys, because it's instead of flying all the way to Utah or a county in Utah to sample one person, well, cluster sample says, well, they are there in the cluster. We can just use them all up. So we get a lot of juice for the squeeze with cluster sampling. Unlike simple random sampling, which is awfully inefficient and best suited for just very small things. So the types of SRS, we have sampling without replacements and sampling with replacements. Those are more of technical nuances that we will not really dwell with. But in general, when we are sampling in surveys, we sample without replacement. So in other words, one individual cannot appear twice. Each individual can only appear once, right? However, you need to be aware of sampling with replacement because we use that in bootstrapping. There are certain statistical procedures we want to do that we want to generate confidence intervals that require bootstrapping. So you should just be aware that bootstrapping involves sampling with replacement, right? But I just put that in for just awareness so that maybe in the future when we're having a webinar on bootstrapping, I will tell you, oh, remember that session we had? And I told you about sampling with replacement. Aha, that's what we're going to build on it. But for the sake of survey design, this is what we want to focus ourselves on, SRS without replacement. So the procedure for simple random sampling is simple. We have a sampling frame like this. The sampling frame, everybody gets a number, like in this case, number 1, number 2. Let me enlarge this. So imagine I want to take a random sample of the most influential personalities in history, right? So we put a number to each one of them. So from the first to the last. And then once we are done, we then say, okay, how many people do we want to select? 50. We now draw a random sample, let's say 50, out of this number. You should never, ever have to worry about this, the technicality of implementing it, because this is why we have technology, so that you don't have to do the grunt work yourself. So we're going to show you how to do that, but just so you have a conceptual understanding of what's going on in the background, that's why we explain it this way. But there are a whole bunch of software that you should rely on for sampling. You absolutely need to understand the theory of what's going on, but in terms of the hands-on part, you absolutely don't have to do that manually. In fact, doing it manually is discouraged because it gives room for error, right? So we're going to explain the conceptual elements as part of our series, that we're going to do hands-on with software. So we're going to, at the end of the session, do hands-on with that exercise so that we can see how it's done. But first, let me explain systematic sampling so that we can build on that and then do the two of them at the same time. Systematic sampling is the only sampling methodology that is influenced by how we sort the sampling frame. That is a very important distinction to know, because with simple random sample, it doesn't matter whether you sort the sampling frame whichever way, it does not matter, it does not affect the results. But systematic sampling is the only one that is affected by how you sort. Systematic sampling is also the only sampling technique that can be both probabilistic and non-probabilistic, right? It is probabilistic if we start with a random start. It is non-probabilistic if we do not start with a random start. I'm going to explain that in detail, but bottom line, you shouldn't be surprised if you're reading a paper and they said, oh, systematic sampling is non-probabilistic. You shouldn't say, oh, that's not what I heard. Well, what I'm saying is that it can be both probabilistic and non-probabilistic, depending on whether the first item that was selected was done at random. We also want to be mindful of errors that arise during sampling. The hallmark of an expert is understanding where errors could come from so that you can address them in your design. Generally, we categorize errors as either sampling errors or non-sampling errors. And sampling errors could be errors that arise from a sampling frame or errors that arise from non-response. So errors that arise from the frame would be that we have an incomplete frame. Remember, we said your sampling frame must have 3 elements. It must be complete, current, and correct. If your sampling frame is not complete, let's say a whole segment of the population is missing, then you have on your hands non-coverage bias, right? Non-response is also a problem that could arise from the frame. But in this case, it means that you have differential non-response. So in other words, let's say I'm doing a survey of, 4 groups, A, B, C, and D. My sampling frame mistakenly omitted all of group D. So my sampling frame only has groups A, B, and C. It means that there's non-coverage bias for group D because group D was not covered in the sampling frame at all. So I go to my groups A, B, and C, and I administer the survey to them. Then I find that, for groups A and groups B, the people who are in the survey are systematically different from those who are not in the survey. Let's say that for group A, 20% of the population is male, but in my survey, it is 50%. That's an issue of non-response. It means that you have differential non-response. So again, in epidemiology in general, we only start to worry when we have the word differential enter the picture. So whenever you hear the word differential, is to start running because there's trouble, right? We don't worry so much when there is non-differential response rate. We worry a lot when the response rate, non-response, is differential. It means that there are differences in the non-response among groups. So the bad thing about non-response is not so much that it is low. It is the fact that it is non-differential. It is differential across groups, right? If it is low and non-differential, then well, we just have to worry about precision. If it is low and differential, we have to worry about issues of precision and validity. Now, if the response rate is high, but we still have differential non-response, we still have to worry about validity, even if the response rate itself is high. So again, we need to worry about frame errors and non-response errors. But then you also have to worry about non-sampling errors. Now, note that if you have frame errors or you have non-response errors, you can still correct them. If you have non-response bias, after the survey, you still have medicine after death. You can still implement medicine after death in this case. You can introduce calibration weights. You can do raking. There's so many things you can do statistically to correct issues of non-response bias. But the problem is, once you have instrument bias, there's no way you can recover from that. There's no medicine after death in that case. So you really want to pay attention to questionnaire design and make sure that there are no inherent biases in non-sampling errors, and because those ones are dangerous and cannot be mediated or remedied once they occur. All right, so for the next of the session, we'll just quickly do the 2 sampling methods for today, which is simple random sampling and systematic sampling. The goal is to make sure that we have some practical experiences, with that, so that when we're applying it in our work, it would make sense for us. In large complex surveys, obviously, like I said, what we'll be using most of the time will be cluster sampling, which what we'll cover in weeks 2 and weeks 3. But you still need to have a very solid understanding of the basics. Simple random sampling and systematic. It would be very bizarre for you to say you know cluster sampling, but you don't know systematics. Like, okay. So you have to know all of these techniques, because you might have instances where you might need to use systematic sampling, and then you might have instances where you have to use some higher or more complex methods. So let's understand our data sets. So here we have a sampling frame. So let's first of all have a context of what we're doing before we even get there. So this is our sampling frame. It's a list of some influential individuals in history, and we want to draw a random sample of, let's say, 50 of them. The first column here is the unique ID. The second column is the name of the individuals that we want to sample. The third is their phone number. The fourth is the zip code they live. The column E is the length of hospitalization. So let's say that all of these people were hospitalized in, let's say, a hospital, right? And our research question is to say, what is the mean level of metabolite X? So each person who was admitted, so these were all the people who were admitted in the hospital. And for each of them, we collected information on their phone numbers, their zip codes, the length of time they spent in hospital. We also collected information on their shoe size. I'm not exactly sure why we did that, but somebody felt it was important to measure their shoe sizes. And this is the outcome that was measured for each person, metabolite X. So now you might wonder, why do we need to, if we already have a whole list, why don't we just survey everybody? Well, we can survey everybody. There's no crime in that. We can do that. But sometimes you might have some, logistical resources or resource limitations. Imagine that for each person we are surveying, we have to give them an incentive of $30 for collecting, for using their data or using their sensitive information. Well, we might not have all the resources to pay everybody, so we might then need to just sample a little. There may be a million reasons why we might want to sample just a few people from an entire sampling frame. So for simple random sample, our objective would be to draw a random sample of 50 people from this list of 200 and something people. We have quite a lot. Let's see. Of 516 people. So that is clear. Simple random sample, as the name implies, it's simple. There's no further intellectual exercise for us to do. It just says, oh, you have 516 people and you need to sample 50. Okay, that's the end of the problem. Nothing more. For systematic sampling, it gets a little bit more tricky. We need to worry about a little more things which we want to agree on before we get in there, so that we don't, you should solve a problem before even touching the tool or technology you're going to solve with. So for systematic sampling, we need to make a decision. What are we going to sort the data on? Remember that for systematic sampling, we say it is the only sampling technique that is affected by how you sort the data, by how you sort the sampling frame. And you must sort the data on something, right? Now, let us look at the options available to us here and make a reasonable decision about which one we should sort on. Remember that our research question is, what is the mean level of metabolite X? This is what we're trying to examine in this research. What is the average level of metabolite X? We have 510 people. For whatever reason, we cannot survey all of them. We can only survey 50. And we need to draw a random sample of 50, first with simple random sampling, and secondly with systematic sampling. We've established that with systematic sampling, we must sort the data first. So the question is, what do we use to sort the data? We can sort the data on zip codes, as the options here. We can sort it on their shoe sizes, but how will that relate to the original question? What is the rule or procedure or standard that we need to be mindful of? Well, the rule is simple. Whatever variable we're using to sort the data on must be very strongly correlated with the outcome. The outcome here is metabolite X, right? Which could be anything, right? Now, we will argue that metabolite X levels will be very strongly correlated with length of hospitalization. Maybe individuals who have been hospitalized for very long periods of time are individuals who are very, very sick. And maybe their metabolite X levels will be very high. Maybe metabolite X is a marker for liver condition or kidney condition. We don't know, right? But you can make a reasonable argument that metabolite X's levels will be very likely strongly correlated with length of hospitalization. It is very hard for anyone to make an argument that, well, metabolite X levels will be very strongly correlated with shoe size. It's like, okay, what's the mechanism for that? Like, how would you make that argument, right? Also, we can look at zip codes. Is there any belief or any basis to assume that your metabolite X levels would vary dramatically based on where you live, your zip code, right? And for some research questions, the answer may be true. For others, it may not be true. In this case, we have chosen to say that metabolite X is a marker for liver function and that it is strongly correlated with the length of hospitalization. So of all the options available to us here, the only one we can reasonably sort on is length of hospitalization, right? This is how you need to think when you're using systematic sampling. You need to, first of all, make sure that your sampling frame has a variable that you're going to use to sort data. Because remember, systematic sampling is the only sampling technique that is affected by what you use to sample, what you use to sort the data on. You might have many options. Like in this case, we have 3 options here: length of hospitalization, shoe size, and zip code. You can only select one indicator to sort the data on. And that one indicator must be the one that is most strongly correlated with the outcome of interest, in this case, metabolite X. So this is how we have selected length of hospitalization as our variable that we're going to use to sort. You need to make all of these decisions based on your subject matter knowledge, right? Way ahead of time before you even go to any software to do anything. You need to understand those basics before you do that. And you need to be able to defend your choice in a way that is intelligent, so that when people say, oh, you know, how did you sort this? Like, why did you choose to use systematic sampling, you know? And you can have a clear idea. So in this case, someone might ask us, oh, so why did you choose to use systematic sampling over simple random sampling? Well, my answer might be, well, we want to make sure that we capture, or we are guaranteed to capture, individuals across the varying spectrums of length of hospitalization. Because remember that with systematic sampling, you first of all sort by this variable, and then you select individuals across the entire spectrum from beginning to the very end. So that makes that guarantees that people across the entire spectrum are captured. You are guaranteed of that, as opposed to simple random sampling, where it's like, okay, well, we hope it's just random chance. We're not very sure. It's likely that everybody's going to be captured across the spectrum, but you don't know. You are relying on chance to make that happen. With systematic sampling, we take it out of the hands of chance and we assign it to the hands of order by sorting it and then selecting at random. So that you should have a clear argument for why you choose to use one methodology over another, right? That is contextual, that is driven by your own context and not by somebody else's context. So that's very important as well. All right, so now that we have our arguments in order, we've made reasonable arguments for why we're going to use one approach over the other. Now let's go ahead and see how we're going to sample. So we're going to use the Chisquares platform to draw samples, because it supports a wide range of sampling methodologies. So let me quickly log in. And so this is the Chisquares platform. For those of you who are not familiar with the platform, it's a one-stop shop for research. You can do sample size calculation, sampling, data collection, and a whole bunch of other things. Anyway, but for today, we just want to focus on our sampling. So we'll come to the sampling tool here, and we can implement various types of sampling approaches or techniques. So you always want to make sure that you have your sampling frame, if you're going to use systematic sampling or simple random sampling, that your sampling method or sampling frame is well prepared and that is complete, correct, and current. So the first thing for us to select is to, on the app here, to select the kind of sampling we want to implement. There are 2 options here. Let me expand it and enlarge this a bit so it's clear, it's large. Automatically draw representative sample, or perform probability sampling on a sampling frame. We would look at this option next week and the 3rd week. This is where the platform uses its own data. We have, on the platform, we've curated data from the census or other statistical bureau of each country of the world, so that you don't have to worry about bringing your own sampling frame, right? However, if you have your own sampling frame, like in our own use case now, we can also upload that sampling frame for the purpose of sampling. So in this case, we're going to go with this option 2, which is perform probability sampling on a sampling frame. We select that. Obviously, you're using a sampling frame, so you have to upload that sampling frame. So let's do that. So you upload a data set that has a sampling frame. let's see if I can find this. I think I created. If not, I can just create a quick sampling frame again. Okay. All right, so we've uploaded our sampling frame. Once you upload your sampling frame, if it's successful, you see a green check that tells you that it's successful. Then next, you have to select a sampling method that you want to use. How do you know which one to select? Well, you are the expert. You should know. That's the whole point of this lecture. No matter how sophisticated the technology or software is, it does not replace you making critical decisions for yourself based on your knowledge of the study's context. So here, I'll go ahead and select which sampling method I want to use. There's a hint here that explains to you, in case you're not sure, there's a whole lecture here on which one you should worry about, how you should choose that. So in case you're lost, you can always refer to that. But first, let's go with simple random sampling first, because remember, our goal is to do those two, simple random sampling and then systematic sampling. You can select a unique identifier, which is optional. In this case, our unique identifier was unique ID. If you want, you can select that, but it's optional. So I always leave things that are optional and leave them as such. Then select the desired sample size. You should have done a sample size calculation before now to know how many people you need at minimum for your study to be precise. In this lecture series, we didn't talk about sample size calculation. We're going to cover that next week. But let's say the sample size you calculated was 300. This tells you how many people you can select. Take note that the platform automatically displays to you the total number of people you have available in your sampling frame. So here we have 516. What does that mean? It means that if I go ahead and say I want 600 individuals, that is an error. Why? Because we're sampling without replacement. If we're implementing sampling with replacement, that means that we can sample 600 from a sampling frame that has 516. That would be mathematically possible if we're sampling with replacement. But we're sampling without replacement, so that means that that is not mathematically possible. You can only select up to 516, but if you select 516, the question is, why are you even sampling in the first place? That's no longer a sample. So I can say, okay, I want to select 200 or 50. That was our original proposal. We want to select 50 people out of the 516. And so I want 50 here. So the platform tells me that number selected is 50. The total available is 516. And now I can click on Get Sample. So what it does is that it applies the probability sampling. And here it has now selected 50 people from me. So the desired sample size was 50. The achieved sample size is also 50. And here it tells you a methodology of what is going on. It says that the program implements a simple random sampling strategy by selecting the desired sample size from the total number of non-missing rows using sampling without replacement. Rows with missing values are first removed, and the remaining rows are treated as unique elements. The probability of selection is equal for each individual row. And so you can look at the probability of SRS. Everybody's selection probability is 0.0969. Everybody has the exact same selection probability, right? So you don't even need to look at this for you to know that. You should be able to automatically know that, oh, well, obviously, 50 people selected out of 513, 50 divided by 513 is this. So you shouldn't even need to look at the software to know that that is what to expect, right? So this is how we have implemented SRS. This is the same data set that we had. It has now added this additional column here, which tells us the probability of selection based on a simple random sample. Now, if we can obviously download that as a spreadsheet and use it in our work. Now, let's resample, but this time, let's select a systematic sampling. Now, we can select a unique identifier if we want to, but that's optional. But now we have a new indicator here that was not there before. Now we must select a sorting variable. Again, remember, this is a characteristic of systematic sampling. It is the only sampling technique that is affected by how you sort it. And that's why you must ensure that what you're using to sort it must be highly correlated with the outcome. In this case, our outcome is metabolite X. And so we have decided collectively, or at least I have decided for all of us, that metabolite X is strongly correlated with the length of hospitalization. And so we're going to use the length of hospitalization as sorting variable. So we use that as our sorting variable. We still need 50 people. And so we get sample, and the system has already implemented already, right? And so here you can see that inherently what happened is that the system has sorted the data by length of hospitalization. And so you can see that the selection of individuals spans from 8, and then the guy with 33 days, and then 6-7 is going, because it was first behind the scenes. What happened was that the system grabbed a sampling frame, then it sorted it by the length of hospitalization, and then it selected a random start. That is very important. The first selection must be random. And then it then applied the sampling interval to select individuals across the entire spectrum. So that's why you have 833. You can see this list keeps going more and more. This guarantees you that people across the entire spectrum will be captured. Again, whenever you implement systematic sampling, you should not be wondering whether everybody has equal probability. You should know that everybody will have equal probability of selection, because simple random sampling and systematic sampling guarantee that everybody will have an equal selection probability. And so this is what we call a self-weighting sample. Self-weighting because you don't need to apply weights, because everybody has an equal selection probability. And then, like before, oops, where am I? Okay. So it also gives you some interpretation here. It tells you that the program executes systematic sampling by initially sorting the list based on a user-provided variable, in this case, the length of hospitalization. It then navigates through the sorted list by leaps of a defined interval until it reaches the desired sample size. Then it gives you some methodology in terms of the math behind the scenes. It tells you that this sampling interval is determined by dividing the total unique elements in the frame by the intended sample size. Sorting the frame and choosing at regular intervals guarantees a diverse selection across the spectrum. Initiating with a random start generated between 1 and the sampling interval ensures the selection process remains probabilistic with equal probability of selection for all participants. So this is very, very key. 2 elements that I really, really want to emphasize with systematic sampling is that systematic sampling can be both random or non-random, depending on how you as the investigator did it. Obviously, if you use a platform like the Chisquares platform, it is guaranteed to be probabilistic because the selection algorithm is one that is built for probability sampling. If you are doing this by your hand, or if you're using another software, you want to read the methodology to make sure that they're doing it in a way that is probabilistic, right? But in a nutshell, that is the basics of today. Today we just wanted to focus on those sampling techniques that are basic, and by basic we mean those that are equal probability. Next week we'll talk more about. We'll go into the terrain of probability sampling techniques that are not necessarily equal probability, right? Then we'll now talk about, okay, wow, now we have a scenario where you have a list of individuals who are not all equally selected. So what do we do there? So next week, the scope is, we'll first of all talk about cluster sampling techniques that give you equal selection probability. Because remember, we said clusters and strata, the answer is, it depends. It depends, depending on how you did it, you can get equal probability or you can get unequal probability. We'll first look at those settings that give you equal probability, because whenever we can, of course, whenever we can, we want equal probability. That saves us so much headache. When you have equal probability, you don't have the headache of saying, oh my gosh, how am I going to worry about weight? How am I going to calculate weight? How am I going to trim the weight? You don't have to worry about all of those things. So whenever you can, you should always aim for an equal probability technique, even when you're using clusters. And that's why on the Chisquares platform, even when you're using cluster sampling, the default approach on the platform is to give you an equal selection cluster sampling, which is a two-stage PPS. It is just so that it makes your life easy. You don't have to worry about all the math and all the stats. The design itself guarantees that it is self-weighting. So those are some of the things we're going to cover next week. I'm going to stop here and see if there are any questions, and I'll take them accordingly. Lungile, are you there? Okay, I guess I'll just call folks. I'll call them as they appear on my list. Jolie Abate, I don't know if you can unmute yourself. Are you able to do that?
Hello, Prof. Thank you so
Yes.
much for another wonderful session tonight. I really enjoyed it. But I have two quick questions, Prof. Now, before today, when we do systematic random sampling, I don't think we are aware or we apply this sorting of variable. So I don't know how you can address that for people who do it by hand without the software. Or how do we know that we are sorting, or how do we overcome that problem of sorting when doing it by hand? That is first question. Second question is, among the types of probability sampling techniques, I didn't get to see multi-phase, multi-stage sampling. I don't know whether that was deliberate or if they are not part of it. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so taking the second question first, multi-stage cluster is still cluster. So we don't need to start talking about one-stage cluster, two-stage cluster, three-stage cluster. They're all clusters. So, it's just keeping things simple, right? But understand that this is cluster. And then you, the investigator, can choose to say, oh, I want to do a one-stage cluster. I want to do a two-stage cluster. So they're not necessarily types of clustering because those are decisions that you need to make yourself. I can decide to say, okay, based on my decision, based on timing, I don't have a lot of time to start doing a three-stage cluster. I'm just going to do a single-stage cluster, or I want to get a lot of granularity, so I'm going to do a three-stage cluster or even a four-stage. So when we're discussing broad sampling techniques, we don't need to now go into the weeds of saying we have cluster, and then you can't say one-stage, two-stage cluster, three-stage cluster. So once it's more than one stage, we call it multi-stage. So if it's two-stage, three-stage, four-stage, that's multi-stage cluster, right? So we don't need to say all of that because we're already saying cluster, understanding that anything after that is your decision to make. And that's what we're going to cover in weeks 2 and 3. How do you even make the decision? How do you decide when to make one stage or two-stage or three-stage, right? And more importantly, it's not just deciding. You need to be aware of what is the implications of your decision. Like, okay, I've decided that it's going to be three-stage. Okay, what is coming? What should I? Mara would say for every action, there's a reaction. It's not just taking the action and then going to bed. You need to be aware that for every action you have taken at the design stage, there is a reaction you need to consider either now or in the analysis stage. So those are things we're going to cover then. Your original question about sorting. If you're doing systematic sampling manually and you are not sorting, you are doing it wrong. Or you're not even aware that you're supposed to sort, you're doing it wrong. That's no longer systematic sampling, right? So I'm not sure exactly how because you're the investigator, right? You're the one that decided I was going to do systematic sampling. Once you've made that decision, you should automatically be aware that you need to sort. So if your systematic selection did not involve sorting of the data, then it's patently wrong. So you need to go and reevaluate it against what we discussed. And this is, again, in general, you want to really avoid doing things, manually, because once manual thought comes in, the likelihood of error increases exponentially. But if you're going to do it manually, then you have to do it the right way and make sure that you sort it. Now, what should you sort it by? Well, we don't know. That's your question to answer, because it's your study, it's your context, and you're the one who should tell us, oh, I'm sorting by this variable because this variable is strongly correlated with the outcome. And so that's how you should think about it. I hope that answers your questions. Okay, we can go to the next person. Julie Webb, your hand is up. I'm not sure if you can unmute yourself. Okay, if you're having challenges, Emmanuel Oko. I'm not sure if you guys can able to unmute yourselves.
Okay, I'm unmuted.
Okay,
thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you for the accurate and the clear teaching and the delivery. It's really very, very good. Please, I just wanted a clarification on the last example you gave with systematic sampling. The desired was 50, and from our sampling frame, after being ordered and the selection was done, we got 47. So what do we do to make up for the remaining 3?
Okay, so thanks. That's a great observation. So let's see. Okay, great. So that's why the platform shows you clearly. You desired 50, but you have 47. The 47 is the context of what's available. So remember that systematic sampling means you are jumping at specific interval. You jump, jump, jump. So sure, you can want heaven and earth, but if the heaven and earth is not available for you, we cannot fabricate heaven and earth for you. We just have to give you what's available, right? So the decision making here is, you may be in the little land when you said I want 50, but practically based on the sampling frame you uploaded, well, this is what's possible. So that's why the platform would clearly display to you what you wanted, which may be delusional or may be accurate, versus what is actually possible in the realm of possibility, within the sampling frame you uploaded. So that you can then know that, okay, well, I wanted 50, but what I can get is 47. So what can you do in that case? Well, when the desirable is not available, the available will have to be desirable. So you either upload a larger sampling frame, or you just take what you have. I hope that answers the question for you. Okay, next question. Clement Elan.
All right. Thank you so much, sir, for the lessons. I learned a lot. So my question is, from the second sampling system you talked about, that's a systematic sampling. I observed that your desired sample size is 50, while the achieved sample size is 47. So can you explain the reasons for the disparity between the desired and the achieved sample size? Thank you.
Okay. All right. Let me let's go to. Let me explain to you what happens here. So you want to sample. So let's say this is our sampling frame, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. All right, so we have this number of elements, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that's our sampling element. So we want to sample 4 out of this with systematic sampling, right? And so when operationally, what the software is doing behind it is saying, okay, we need to know two things before we can do that. We need to sort the data. So let's assume that that has already been sorted. So check on that. Next, it's like, okay, how many people do you need? We say we need 4 people. All right, check. We have that information already. Next, for us to do a systematic sampling, we need to remember systematic sampling. All it's doing is jumping. It's jumping from point A to this and then jumping like that at intervals. So the question is, how wide should we jump in this context, right? That's what we call the sampling interval. Systematic sampling is saying we're going to be jumping and jumping and jumping till we get to the end. The sampling interval is simply equal to the sample size in the sampling frame or the length of the sampling frame divided by the number of people we want to sample. So in this case, the length of our sampling frame is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That means that our sampling interval, let's write this down, sampling interval here equals 7 divided by this. So that means that, of course, we can't jump 1.4 people. We have to round to 2. So this is approximately 2 people, right? We have to jump every 2 people. Now, where do we start from? We can start any number between 1 and the sampling interval. In this case, sampling interval is 2. So the random start will be random number between 1 and 2. So the system tells us, okay, start from 1. So again, you note the number of rows in your sampling frame, and then you determine the number of people you want to sample from, right? Based on those 2, you calculate the sampling interval, which is 2, and then you select your random start. So this is what we call our random start. Why am I making so many types? Random start. So that means that we'll start from 1 and we'll jump 2 steps subsequently. So we select this guy here, and then we jump 2 steps, 1, 2. We select this guy next. Then we jump 2 steps, 1, 2. We select this guy next. And then we jump 2 steps next, 1, 2. Select this guy next. Now, in this case, we're fortunate because the 5 people we wanted are within the realm of what we have. But now, imagine if we had said we wanted 6 people. Now, let's extend that argument. You wanted 6 people. Well, 1, 2, there's nobody here anymore, right? So there is nothing to select after that. So sure, you wanted 6 people, but what we can give you is 5, because we cannot make up reality just because you wanted 6, right? What you can have is 5. So it's about balancing the reality in your data set or your sampling frame with what you wanted. Your want may have just been a wish expressed as a number, but it's any credible platform should not just grant you your wish because you wished it so, because then that's when you start having a lot of errors in just saying, oh, because the individual wanted this number, we must bend backwards to somehow make mathematical, realities come through in a way that doesn't make any sense. So no, so that's why the platform will give you, and sometimes you will get what you wanted, right? If your sampling frame is big enough. In other cases, you just have to adjust with what is possible, obviously mathematically. I hope that answers the question. All right, Faraja, your question, please.
Can you hear me, please?
Yes, we hear you clearly.
Yes, thank you, Prof, for this brilliant presentation. It's surely a high-level point of view, and we are grateful for this. So I have 3 small questions, and the first one is, what does decide us to choose this or that sampling technique between all these you just told us? This is the first small question. The second small question is, what happens now to online service as the sampling frame comes into play? Because, sometimes we say for national service, because we don't have logistic, support, or we don't have these facilities to travel from county to county, to survey all these people, physically or manually or through, for example, pads. So what happens in case we choose to proceed by online service? How do we calculate, or how do we make this sample? How do we get use of this sample framing once we use the online survey? Because we can have, for example, some limitation criteria for online service. Those who are outside the country cannot participate. It may be possible for some cases, but what happens, for this online service, and what is your advice once we need to use online service? And the last question is, for this kind of sampling you are showing us, we had, I think, the sample data set of 516, I think, but we choose only 50. But I think the survey has already been done for this 516. But now we select only 50 people. We need to make analysis from these 50 people. So can we consider that this is about secondary data analysis, because it's drawn from the primary data with 516 people? So what is, how can we perform this? Do we need to go from the start, or we can use this secondary data to make our analysis? These are my three small questions, even though they are a little bit longer, Prof.
Thanks. I contest you're calling them small questions. They're by no means small. But all right, let's answer them. The first one was, who decides which sampling technique to use? You decide. It's your job. This is what, science or research must be done by people who understand research. That's the basic ethical principle at play. So it's your responsibility, your burden to decide which sampling technique will be appropriate here, or maybe which one will be better in this context. And that's why this is why we are providing sessions like this, so that you are informed. But ultimately, you should be aware that it's your responsibility to decide which sampling technique is best for a particular context. And like I said, it's a science and an art. There's no right or wrong answer. So don't feel that, oh man, if I make this decision, then it's wrong. We don't really want to look at things from the framework of right or wrong. It's like, okay, which is more appropriate for this context versus that context? So that's the first one. The second question was about online surveys. So you don't have resources, but you want to do online survey for a national survey. How is that going to work? It's context. You're not going to do an online survey in an environment where people don't have access to emails. And remember, we said the very first question you have to worry about is, does a sampling frame exist, or can I create one? So the question is, can you create a sampling frame, which is a list of everybody? So your question assumes, this is what your question assumes. It assumes that we're going to have a list like this in the whole country that says Mr. A lives so and so place, location 1, and this is his email. Number 2, and you're going to create that kind of list for the whole country, right? That assumes you have that. Now, in the US, we've done experimental surveys like this. Recently we've done like large surveys like the Pulse surveys, where we go to phone providers and say, hey, Mr. Phone Provider, of network service provider, we are trying to do a national survey, and we would like to take a random sample of phone numbers that you have in your network. So this is what we've done. So we'll take a random sample of phone numbers. Most people use smartphones these days. So when we send them a text message, hey, this is from the Census Bureau, we want to do a survey, kindly click the link in this text message to take the survey. So in that case, that is still a probabilistic sample, because we have a number at the top and a number at the bottom. The number at the bottom is everybody who uses a mobile phone in this country. We can access that data and send them surveys, right? Now, your desire to conduct such a survey assumes that you have the ability to create such an infrastructure where you can take a random sample of, let's say, phone numbers in the whole country. Let's say you are in a country, let's say you have Globacom or MTN, and you can say, hey, Want to do a national survey, you go to all the major providers and draw, phone numbers, and then you text everybody. It also assumes that people use smartphones and that they can click the link in the survey or in the text message and access the survey. So that's it's not an easy assumption at all, especially if you are in a country where people don't have access to the internet or constraints like that exist. You may not necessarily be able to pull this off, but depending on your context, you also might. So now, online survey also doesn't mean that they got it as text. You can also have a mechanism where you create the paper surveys and you drop them at households and you include a QR code on the questionnaire, which is also something we have done extensively. 2016 or thereabout, we're doing a national survey an international survey, actually, US and Canada, where we did exactly that. For individuals with emails, we send them by email. For individuals without emails, to address issues of non-coverage bias, we've mailed the stuff at their addresses. I will give them two options. You can either return it by mail, or you can just scan the QR code and take the survey online. So it's still an online survey that was delivered via mail. So you can think creatively of ways to say, okay, how do we address issues? But it's by no means a trivial question. It's something that you have to think very, you have to be very, creative to solve the problem. So that's that about that. And then thirdly, you asked a question about, I have completely forgotten the third question you asked. Do you mind reminding me, please? I'm sorry, I can't remember the third question. All right. You can drop it in the chat and I'm going to answer it. But meanwhile, we'll go to Dr. Eric Osei.
Yeah, so, okay, so, Doc, thank you very much for the opportunity. My question is, must you have always have sampling frame before you can apply systematic sampling? For example, you are doing a survey at a facility, at the outpatient department, and you want to know their views regarding the quality of services provided by their facility. Can you use systematic sampling in this situation without having a sampling frame? Thank you.
So if you're trying to say, okay, we want to go to a ward of patients, and we're going to let's go every fifth bed, where you have inherently sorted. So even though you don't have a sampling frame where you have sorted, you have implicitly sorted by saying, okay, we're going to go to every fifth bed. So every fifth bed, we're going to ask every fifth patient. Well, you may not have sorted with a data set, but you have actually sorted in your mind already by saying every fifth bed. That's sort based on their literal position on the bed. Now you're going to have a problem if the location on the bed has nothing to do with the outcome of interest. Remember that the variable that you're using to sort must be strongly correlated with the outcome of interest. But in this case, you're simply going, okay, we just walk into the hospital. I will start with bed number 1. Now, there's a problem there. You just started with the very first bed. Not that it was selected at random, but because it's the very first. That is not, you have automatically turned the whole survey into non-probability based just by saying, okay, we're just going to start with number 1, which is obvious. Well, it's not so obvious. It's non-probability now. And then you're saying, okay, we're going to select every 50 patients based on their arrangements, based on how they are arranged, on the ward, right? So you have just chosen the location of the beds as the sorting variable. That raises question. How correlated is the positioning with the outcome? It may have no correlation whatsoever. And so the question is, why? Why then did you do that? Remember that the sorting variable must be correlated. So yes, in systematic sampling, you are always sorting on a variable, whether you're sorting it in a data set or in your mind, by, let's say, arrangement of patients. It is something that must happen and always happen for it to be systematic sampling. Rashid Ibrahim.
Yeah, thank you very much, my prof. Yeah, I want to confirm, or let me say confirm, or just let me say that can we use sample techniques to determine our sample size? And likewise, is our research topic determine the sample method we are to use?
Yeah, so there are two questions we want to ask, right? The question of how and how many. Two very different questions. Question of how many is sample size. Question of how is sampling. So I first of all determine, okay, how many people do I need? All right. Okay, now I know that I need 50. Now, a very different question is, okay, how then am I going to select the 50? So those are two completely different questions. One is an issue of precision, which is sample size. The other is an issue of validity, which is sampling. Now, your second question was, is my research question related to my sampling method? Yes, it is. I can say my research question is just to see, you know, the recommendations from some of the strategic principles, you know, or let's say community elders on a particular issue. In this case, I might say, okay, I don't need to make my results generalizable. I just need to understand some of what the key stakeholders think. So in this case, I don't even need to worry about random sampling. I can just say, okay, I'm going to use purposive sampling or judgmental sampling in a way that is very specific. Or let's say my research question is about a very rare disorder. We've done a lot of work on genetic conditions, which tend to be quite rare finding patients, right? So in that case, the only sampling method available to us is, you know, snowball sampling, where we get referrals. One patient recommends the next and recommends the next. So indeed, the research question will determine the sampling, you know, in most cases, but it's now your choice. Even within the same research question, there are a million and one ways you can cut and, you know, slice how you want to sample. And remember, it's both science and an art. So the goal, the moral of the story for today is that you should be very imaginative. Just allow your mind to wander and to be creative, because there's no restriction that this is how you must sample. As long as you understand the basics, you are free to design your study in however way you want to sample. As far as you understand what the intent of the study is, are you planning to generalize or not to generalize? And then you can go from there. Okay, kidney. Is that kidney, Josiah? You have a very unique name, I must say. Yeah, please, you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Oh, I'm not sure whether your hand was raised, was it? Now I'm very confused. I'm not sure whether your name was the one that caught my attention or you had your hand up. All right, Henry, if I think your hand is clearly up.
All right. Thank you very much for the wonderful lecture. I kind of learned a lot. My questions, I have like 3 questions. The first question is, you talked about the fact that systematic random sampling could have an equal probability and non-equal probability. So I don't know if you can throw more light as to under what condition can we have systematic random sampling to have unequal probability. Then number 2 is when we have this unequal probability for systematic random sampling, is there a measure we can take to correct for the non-equal probability? Does it have any effect on the desired outcome? And the last one is for we are conducting a study currently where we are going to send out questionnaires. We know the total population of the class, right? And we've calculated the sample. But then this questionnaire will be sent online. And even though we know the total number of the people in each class to fill the questionnaire, we are not really I don't know, there's no specific measures put in place to ensure who gets to fill that questionnaire. So I don't know if, from what you have said today, that should fall under probability sampling, but what specific type of sampling that would that be, since we don't get to assign specific numbers? However, we know the numbers we want to get and the total number. Yeah, thank you.
All right, great. So about systematic sampling is always a equal probability selection, right? So, but what I meant earlier was that it could be probabilistic or non-probabilistic depending on how the first unit was selected. And, you know, the example was I think the scenario that we painted where you say, okay, I want to sample individuals on the streets. And then you tell your research assistant that, well, go into each street and then start from the first house and then select every 5 houses from there subsequently. You see, you have introduced a lot of problems in that design by telling this research assistant to start from the first house. You have made the survey to become non-random, because remember that for systematic sampling to be random, the first unit must be randomly selected. In this case, it was not randomly selected. You just told them specifically, start from the first house. So the first unit must be selected at random, and that random number must be a random number between 1 and the sampling interval. So you need to be able to do all of those things, you know, if you're going to do it manually. But again, this is why we create, the reason why we create technology is to reduce manual work. So if you're not sure, so there are two groups of researchers, those who really know what they're doing and should do things manually if they want. But if you're not sure, just use software that has been validated for that purpose. So that way you don't run into the risk of doing the wrong thing or interpreting the data the wrong way. Now, you talked about a second scenario where you are designing a survey and you want to distribute it to a whole bunch of classes. And people can take the surveys as they need or may not take it. So how does this tie in with the issue of random or non-random surveys? Now, there are many, when we're designing surveys, there are several things we need to worry about. One is obviously the issues of sample size and then sampling. But then very importantly, the next stage is how do we field the survey? In other words, how do we share the survey to people? In terms of sharing a survey, there are 2 types of surveys. We have open surveys or closed surveys. A closed survey, as the name implies, is closed to individuals. Only individuals who are invited can participate. So for a survey to be closed, you have to upload an email list of people to the platform, and then the platform will share the invites to them. You can set reminders and say, if they have not responded, please send them a reminder, and the system will automatically enforce that requirement. An open survey, however, is the one that doesn't have, it's an open link, which you're just sharing with everybody. Like, take, for example, this evaluation form that you're completing now. That's an open survey. There's just a link that is shared. People can forward the link. They can do whatever with it. Once you implement a survey like that, it becomes an open survey. It becomes non-random, even if it was designed as random, right? Imagine you put a link on WhatsApp or Facebook and say, hey, people take the survey. The link can be shared, open up, it can be propagated in ways you never imagined it to be. So you can never know the denominator now because it has been forwarded so many times that you don't know who it was sent to. And so this is a case like this in your survey where it's open. And so in this case, any inferences can only be, really within the context of participants who took the survey. You cannot generalize per se because you don't know, if you don't know who is part of a denominator, then it's hard to know, whether or not the results are generalizable. All right, next question, David. David Karatu. All right, Desaline, you have a question? Or is that an old hand? Okay, I'm not sure whether these are all hands, but Faraja, David. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, let's start. Thank you, Prof. I really enjoy it, the lesson. Only I have one question. Practically on the ground, which one of the probability methods give more representative results? Just in simple random sampling, there may be important, but in case of minority groups, from the systematic and the simple random sampling, which one of them may represent the population? The second
All
is,
of them. Okay.
Is there any meaningful difference between precision and reliability? Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, thank you very much. So precision means reliability. And in terms of representation, all of these probability techniques will be representative if implemented well. But I think the crux of your question really lies in that first part where you said, in practical terms, on the ground, which of these techniques is most should we really use? Should we worry about? Well, if you were going to be a one-trick pony and you were going to learn one sampling technique, the one you should really, really worry about if you're doing large surveys is cluster sampling, right? You should really know cluster sampling in and out. And if you're worried about representation from groups, then you should know cluster sampling plus stratification, because that's why we worry about why we do stratification. Stratification is like saying, okay, we're going to do cluster sampling, but we want to make sure that some minority groups are covered adequately. So we're going to stratify them and then select within those strata. We're going to cover all of this extensively next week. But just to reinforce, if you wanted to say, oh, you know what, I just want to know one thing about sampling and one thing alone, and I want to use it for large surveys, well, then that's a simple answer. The simple answer is, well, you have to worry about cluster sampling, and you have to know it like the back of your hand. So we're going to cover that next week. Okay.
There are some questions in the chat.
Okay, already. Can you read them out, please?
Okay. Any difference between sample frame and population?
The sampling frame is they may or may not be the same, depending on what the case is. So the sampling frame, I think we had a picture from, hold on a minute. If I can pull that up. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. I think this was this. Alrighty. This is not what I was thinking about. Anyway, sampling frame versus population. The sampling frame is a list of the population. We hope that it is complete, current, and correct. If it is that, if those assumptions are met, then the sampling frame is the population. That's simple. Now, the reality, however, is that life is not as simple as we always think it is. It is very rare for you to have a sampling frame that is indeed complete, correct, and current. So in reality, the sampling frame may not be the same as the population. Why? Because it's not complete, because it's not current, because it's not correct. So we wish that it is the same as the population, but it might not be.
Thank you very much. Another one says, Prof, could you give us some examples for snowball sampling?
Okay, snowball sampling, that's like, I give an example of when we're studying a rare disorder. So if you're studying, let's say, a rare genetic disease, and you have a handful of patients, or maybe you went on TikTok and you found people who say, oh, I have this condition, or you went on YouTube, or you went to a hospital, and then you say, okay, I'm conducting a survey among people living with this condition. For every patient you recommend, we would like to interview them and we'll give them incentives of whatever. Please, can you recommend them to us? Or you go to a community on Facebook, a Facebook community, right? Let's say people living with condition X, and you tell the administrator, hey, we're conducting a survey of these people. Do you mind forwarding this link to everybody who is in your community and those who are eligible can then forward it to their their friends or family or acquaintances who also have a similar condition. See, it's a snowball because snowball sampling literally means snowball. If you during winter, you have imagine a snowball that starts falling from the top of the mountain down. The snowball gets bigger and bigger as it goes down the mountain because it gathers more and more snow. So as it rolls down the hill, it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. That's the idea behind snowball. Snowball is that we start small at the top, and then as people forward it to their groups, the sample size becomes larger and larger as people forward the survey to other people in their network. So that's an example of snowball.
Thank you. Kindly provide principles guiding each sampling techniques.
Well, that's what we're going to cover throughout this session, these 3 weeks. For what we have covered today, the principle is that make sure that your sampling frame is complete, it's correct, and it's current. You obviously need to understand that you are in the driver's seat. So you're not going to be waiting for somebody else to come and tell you what to use. You should know that for every action, there's a reaction. So every decision you take in sampling, there are reactions that you need to be aware of. That is the hallmark of expertise. Making decisions and not being aware that there are consequences is not a good thing. You should be aware of what happens when you take a decision and what needs to be corrected either now or down the line. But as we cover the next few weeks, we're going to discuss each principle that is peculiar to each study design.
Okay. There is one here I think you spoke a little bit about. Can you please demonstrate how to do both simple random and systematic sampling in Excel?
We've already given the principle, so you can go and write a script that will do that for yourself in Excel. But I think we've already explained also how to do systematic in Excel.
Okay, there's one here that says, you mentioned differential in response rate among groups and how it should be a cause for concern. How should this be managed?
You manage it with weights. You create weights to make the results generalizable again, which we're going to cover down the line. But if you don't want to worry about that, you have to change your intentions. Your intentions was originally to make it generalizable. But now you realize that, oops, we have errors in our sampling, whether they came from sampling or non-sampling errors, that may mean that our results may not be generalizable. So when a desirable is not available, the available must be desirable, which is the foundational principle of what we're going to be talking over and over. The principle that when a desirable is not available, the available must be desirable. Well, the desirable was, well, we want to do a representative sample, but now conditions have told us that, well, it's clear that our sample is not representative. We either default and just say, well, we're just going to deal with a non-representative sample, or if we're stubborn, we can say, well, we're going to calculate weights. We're going to use calibration weights. So that's part of what we're going to cover in this syllabus.
Okay, Prof. As another one here says, Prof, what would be the most pragmatic way of conducting a mole intercept survey from selecting the first respondent and the sampling interval?
The pragmatic is based on context. So the issues of pragmatism are hardly black and white that we can answer in the context like this. It's all based on context. You are in the driver's seat, so we trust you make those decisions clearly.
Okay, I think for now, these are the only questions in the chat.
Okay.
But I think some persons have their hands raised up. Eric, do you want to ask a question? Mr. Eric, do you want to ask a question? Okay, appears he's not close by. Mr. Goodluck, kindly unmute and ask your question, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear it clearly.
Hello.
Yes. Yes, we can hear
Okay,
it.
so
Thank you very much. When we talked about generalizable and non-generalizable sampling methods, you said that once the sample size is not known, you don't regard that as generalizable. So I looked at a situation where, say, you have a class of 300 persons, and then you share a survey to them, and at the end of the day, because it's an online survey, for example, you do not know how many responses you're going to get, or even if it's on paper, but at the end of the day, you share, let's say, 300, whether by email or by any means, you share to those 300 persons, and at the end of the day, what you get is like, say, 200 responses. Is it fair to say that even with 200 responses, you cannot say that the response is generalizable? That's the outcome of that research is generalizable. I feel we have enough number of persons presented in the survey to think that it is now okay to generalize and say this applies to the number of persons in general. So I would like to know if that is possible.
Okay, thanks. That's a great question. The only issue in the logic is that you are conflating sample size with validity. The argument being made is that large samples therefore mean that they are valid, because generalizability means validity. It means external validity, to be specific. But sample size has nothing to do with validity. You can have this is what we talk about the expression big for nothing. You can have a very large sample size that is by no means representative. One of the largest studies in the US is called All of Us. All of Us made up of 1 million people or more. That's the goal, to recruit 1 million Americans in this study. But it is not representative. Why? Because it's not randomly sampled. It's a convenient sample. So it doesn't matter that it's 1 million people. It's still not representative. So validity is not a question of how many people you have. The issue of how many people is a different matter entirely. It's an issue of precision. But the question is, these 200 people, is there a systematic difference? If you can explore and see that, okay, if you compare these 200 people who answered the survey with the 100 who did not, can you see any systematic differences between these two groups? If there are systematic differences, that means that they're not generalizable then. It means that there's a systematic difference between respondents and non-respondents. And so that is, a case of non-generalizability. Now, does it mean that the results are useless? No, you can still use the results. You can make inferences. You can still say inferences from this study apply to the majority of participants in your class. That is still a valid statement to make. But to generalize the results to the entire class may not be valid. So you can say, of those who took this survey, 60% are unhappy with their grades, right? But you can't say of the whole class, 60% are unhappy with their grades, because you have not established yet that there is no systematic difference between respondents and non-respondents. I hope that is clear. So whenever we talk about sample size, what we're referring to is issues of precision. Issues of validity is how did we sample them? Did we sample in a way that is probabilistic? And are there systematic differences between individuals who were surveyed versus those who were not surveyed, or those who responded versus those who did not respond?
Okay. There is one here say, thank you, Prof. This is very enlightening. I have learned something new today, sorting and systematic sampling. Thank you very much, Prof.
You're welcome.
There is another one here that says from YouTube, thank you, Prof, for the wonderful presentation. I have a question, sir, slightly outside the scope of today's class. Just want to know, sir, if self-made questionnaire is allowed in KPA studies.
Yeah, so again, there's nobody whom you have to look upward, who you have to look for or look forward to allow you to do something, right? You are the one in the driver's seat. So that's one of the things we really want to hammer consistently. There's nobody who is allowing or preventing you from doing anything. you are the boss. You're the one in the driver's seat, right? So yes, even questions that are validated, because the crux of that question is essentially saying, do we have to create a validated question? Do we have to use validated questions before the study can be considered valid? If I, as an individual researcher, created my own questions, can they be considered valid for the purpose of research? Of course, they can be valid. But validity is not something that the gods just drop lessons on the question. It's about the process you went through to validate the questions, right? One way is to just use questions that have already been validated. But even then, you must refactor them for your own context, right? The fact that some questions were validated in the US context does not mean that they're applicable to your own context. But even if you were to sit down and create your questions from scratch, you would have to go through a process of validation. That's what we call cognitive testing, right? Meaning that you are saying, is the question valid? Is it leading? Is it double-barreled? Is what we are measuring what we think we are measuring, right? And so you do cognitive testing. You gather a bunch of people, you administer the survey to them, and you ask them, all right, when you read this question, what comes to your mind? What do you think this question is asking? Or when you were answering this question, what were you thinking, right? And you go through all of them, right? This is the process we take to validate questionnaires. It's not some special process that is done in heaven. It's something that anybody can do, right? So yes, even if you created your own question, they can be valid if you went through the process of validating them. And that process is something that any one of us can do.
Okay, sir. Mr. Daniel Ejeokwabi, your hand is up. If you can please unmute and ask your question.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof, for the enlightening session. My question has to do with some text that we've come across, usually put what we call a multi-stage sampling. And that is, let's say in the selection of a sample, they are different. You use, let's say, you use simple random sampling for one stage. And then when you move to the next stage, you use systematic random sampling. That is my understanding of multi-stage sampling. Is that correct? That's my first question. Then secondly, the first question delves into this, in that, for example, if you want to study students, let's say we want to study a group of students in a particular university, for example, do we now do the multi-stage sampling, or we'll have to do another type of probability sampling? Then my last question has to do with the issue of one or two people have commented on it, but I want you to also shed more light. For example, in the one that we studied, or the sampling that was done for systematic, you got 47 instead of the 50. Is it permissible to start the sampling afresh to get the extra 3 people that are required by the survey? Thank you very much, sir.
All right, thanks. So, like I've said, we really want to get away from the space of thought processes like, are we allowed to, is it permissible? No, you are in the driver's seat. You should feel empowered to make decisions about study design as long as you understand the principles. The principles should be driven by, the approach should be driven by what you are trying to achieve in the study. So if you sampled for 7 out of 50, well, that is what the sample size, the sampling frame can accommodate. Now, should you want to change the sample size? Of course, you can go ahead and do it. Everything, it's your study. You can do whatever you want, right? But you should definitely have it. It shouldn't become a fishing expedition where you're like, oh, let's do this, let's try this. Yeah, it should be driven by a clear understanding of what you're trying to achieve. So that is that. Just to emphasize that we should feel empowered to be in the driver's seat. Sampling is a science and an art. That's what we established that so heavily at the beginning. So that means that you should feel comfortable. You should get comfortable making decisions about your own study. You don't need somebody's approval to say, oh, is this correct? As long as you understand the principles, it's both a science and an art. So the art form means that there's a personality flair that comes with saying, okay, this is how I would like to do it. I want to, use this method. It's completely fine. Now, the original question where you said multi-stage sampling means that we're using different study designs at different stages. That is not entirely true. We don't care about methods. Methods is not something that we care about per se. It's just a means to an end. So when we say multi-stage, it's not that we just want to be, razzling and dazzling the people with different methodologies at different stages. No. What we're trying to do is that we're trying to get to an objective. This is where we started from, and there's a destination we're going to. And the question is, what is the fastest way for us to get from destination point A to point B? That's all we're saying. It's about a journey, right? And we're saying, okay, we're going to map this journey. It's like, imagine yourself driving, right? You're doing a cross-country tour, and you're like, okay, I'm going to plan my trip. This trip, I'm going to have 4 resting points. I'm going to rest at this point. I'm going to rest at this, and so on and so forth. Those are entirely your decisions to make. Somebody can say, you know what, this trip I'm planning, I'm going to rest only once, and zoom. I'm going to just zoom the whole way through. And that person might say, I'm going to have 2 rests. These are entirely personal decisions that are based on your understanding of the context and what you want to achieve. So when we are doing a multi-stage sampling, it's not that we want to use the goal is not just to use different methods at different stages. The goal is to ask the question, how best can we get from point A to point B, which is where we are headed to? And it could be that saying, okay, let's say we want to do a survey of students. It could be that we say, okay, let us first of all identify schools in the first stage. And then when we identify schools in the first stage, we will select a sample of classrooms in each school in the second stage. And then within each classroom, we'll now select a sample of students in each classroom. So we're moving from schools to classrooms to students. Somebody else might say, you know what, but how are we going to select the schools? How about let us select local government areas first, and let's select counties first in the first stage, and then within each selected county or local government, we'll then select schools, and then we'll select classes, and then we'll select students, so that we have a 4th stage. Another person can come up with a different idea, but in all of these ideas, it is simple. What we're trying to achieve is, how in the world are we going to get from point A to point B? What we want to get is get to the students. So the question is, how do we get to that? And so the journey itself is not interesting. The journey is, okay, whatever road you take, right? That doesn't really matter. The question is, do we eventually get to the students? Now, if we had a sample of a list of the students at the beginning, we wouldn't even need to do all this talk. We'll just sample from that list, but we don't have a list. And that's why we're going through this journey of saying, okay, we want to get to the students, and this is where we are. Which path will give us the fastest route to get to the students? So if you can afford to do a 2-stage sample or a 2-stage cluster, don't just do a 4-stage because you want to make it complicated. Like, why do you want to make things complicated for yourself? If you can do it in 1 stage, do it in 1 stage. If you can avoid cluster sampling, avoid it. If you can do it 1 stage, do it. But by all means, use the simplest approach that will take you from point A to point B, because that's what we're interested in, not the methodology. I hope that answers your question. Okay, next question, please.
How do we determine the sample size using the simple random sampling?
Okay, we're going to do issues of sample size calculations next week. But, one of the things you can also try it on the Chisquares platform. There's a sample size module. I'm not sure whether I'm still sharing my screen. Am I? Okay, maybe not. So you can try your hand before we come to next week's session. You can try playing with the sample size calculation module on the platform so that to do that, you come to sample size here and you start new sample size. You select your study that you're doing. So in this case, a cross-sectional study with percentage as outcome, and you fill in the parameters. The platform has already provided you with some of the default values, but you can read the information beside each item here to get more context for what is being asked. And once you're done, you can click on Get Sample. So, you can play with the sample size calculator, look at, try imputing different parameters and see how does the sample size change when the anticipated response rates changes from X% to X%. That's one very good way to learn. So we're going to cover this in detail next week.
Thank you very much.
Hello.
Okay, Mr. David, go ahead.
Hello. Yeah, thank you.
We can hear you.
Thank you, Prof. You've been empowering us over these few months. I really appreciate it. My question is, how will the method? How will you describe a method in which that is multi-stage, that involves both probability and non-probability sampling at various stages, and what is the implication on this on generalizability?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. The answer
Hello?
is yes. You can hear it clearly. We heard your question very well. So it's a one-drop rule. One drop of non-random sampling makes the whole sampling non-random. So it doesn't matter whether you had 10 stages of random and then you had one stage of non-random. The whole study is now non-random. So it has to be probabilistic at every single stage for it to be probabilistic, because one entry of non-probabilistic makes the whole study non-probabilistic.
All right. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Okay, Mr. U.S. Ekanem, please unmute and ask your question. Mr. Ekanem, you can please unmute and ask your question.
Right. Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Clearly, yes.
Right. Thank you very much, Prof. Mine is about the sorting. I just learned that for the first time today, and I want to say thank you very much. Now I want to share a practical experience. I'm working with pregnant women, and I'm trying to find out their experience on domestic violence. And so going to the health facility, I already have my sample size, and using the register, I've already determined my sampling interval. And I've already decided that getting to the health facility, the first recruit, I'm going to do that by simple random sampling. But I'm just learning about sorting for the first time today. How do I input that into what I'm doing?
So, and these are some of the questions that you need to ask, because there's a plethora of options for you. It's like a full buffet when you're using sampling, right? So the question is, which one should I use? And those are some of the practical questions that you might want to consider. Question being, is it even possible for me to sort in any meaningful way? In your use case, it becomes like, okay, it may not be so practical in that case, because I'm going to pregnant women, I'm just selecting what I can find. So maybe that may not be the best way of selecting probabilistically. Maybe a better approach would be to treat each facility or the facilities as clusters and then use cluster sampling. That might be more appropriate to the use case, because again, this requires me having a sampling frame. And if I don't have a sampling frame to sort by, then a better option would be to use cluster sampling, where in this case, I treat the different facilities as clusters and then sample from each. Another option is to say, okay, if I have just if I'm sampling from all the facilities, I can choose to say, I'm going to use days of a week as clusters. So I say, okay, I'm going to go on this day of the week, and then I'm going to sample everybody, all the pregnant women who come on that day of the week, right? Or there are different ways you can think of that. As far as you can, clusters don't have to be geographic units. They can be time units, where we'll say, okay, we're going to divide the time into 12 months, or into days of a week, and then we'll sample accordingly. Any of those could work. And it's also possible that you could say that for this study here, the inference is really among these women. We don't really care about making generalizability to the world of pregnant women all over, right? We're just interested in the women who attend this clinic. And so I'm going to relax the study's entry assumptions and just say, we will come whatever day we want, and we'll take everybody we want. And it's fine for the study to be a convenient sample, right? Convenience means that it was designed at our convenience so that we grabbed everybody we wanted. So by design, it's non-probabilistic, but it's still extremely useful, because by lowering the entry requirement, it makes it easy for us to just worry about the logistics of a study and not about probability issues, which in this study might be appropriate as well. And then we can then proceed with data collection that way. So you have a whole plethora of options at your disposal to choose which one makes more sense in your context.
All right, thank you so much. My problem here is that it's an academic work, and the examiners it's required that it must be, the sampling technique must be scientific, and this and non-probability sampling would not be acceptable.
Okay. All right. So in that case, your options, your options might be to just use cluster sampling, and then because now even if you use a convenient sample, if you had, because the women who attend the clinic, you have a roster. It's possible for you to go back to the hospital and say, here's a full roster of all the women who attended this clinic in the past 12 months. You can actually construct a sampling frame of all the women who attended the clinic. So that means that you can compare your sample that you have to the demographics of all the women. So the demographic profile of the women in your sample to the demographic women of all the women who could have been sampled. Now, if they're not the same, this is where weights come in. We can create weights that, the whole point of weights is to force the sample to look like the parent population, right? So even if your sampling methodology is non-probabilistic, there are so many statistical ways to improve generalizability. That is a whole world of weights and weighting methodology. So that is still an option. But for if it's for an exam, then it's always better to err on the side of caution and just use a probability sampling technique right from the word go to avoid unnecessary questions. So if we can avoid the questions, then we can avoid them by the design stage.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Next question here says, which sampling is this when each student are allowed to make their choice either to exercise or not exercise in a study?
So each student is allowed to make their choice. Now, the issue is, it's not very clear because I'm not sure whether all students are in the study, and then you're allowing within that choice whether people are not allowed. So it's possible that you might have, I think what you're trying to create is an example of a non-randomized experiment where you have an intervention and you say, hey, who of you wants to exercise? And who of you wants to do whatever the other intervention is, right? But without more context, it's impossible to answer the question because that could be a non-randomized experiment where people choose which arm of the treatment they want to be in. It could be a volunteer sampling where individuals volunteer to be in your study. Let's say your study is about exercise and not necessarily about testing and intervention. You could also have a scenario where people volunteer to be in the study. Once you are volunteering, that's a volunteer sample, which is also a non-probabilistic technique. But without much more context, it's impossible to answer the question. All right, next question, please.
Okay, Mr. Ayo Akimbowa, your hand is up. Please, you can ask a question. Okay, it appears the hand has dropped. Okay. For now, I don't think I can't see any other question for now.
Okay, well, in that case, thanks everyone, and we look forward to our next session where we'll now build on this and talk about more advanced designs, including clusters and all the other derivatives. So we look forward to seeing you in class next week. Have a great weekend.
Appears some persons don't want you to leave, Prof. Two hands have popped up.
Do you want to answer all the questions remaining, Josiah, or you want to ask them now?
You tell me.
Okay. I'll take one last question then.
Okay, Mr. Ayo, your hand is up. Please go ahead.
Okay, hello, Prof. I was having difficulty on muting, so I had posted the question, but let me just read it out.
Your last answer on pregnant women suggests it is acceptable for a researcher to draw up a sample frame by conducting a census of available respondents. Can such a frame be used to support a probability sampling technique?
Okay. All right. So my answer was in the context of there are two ways to look at it, right? Medicine before death and medicine after death. So medicine before death is we go to the hospital and get a sampling frame. But the problem, however, is that the women have not attended the clinic yet. So it's still a future event. You can't create a sampling frame for something that does not exist yet. Like, we don't know all the women that will come to the clinic next month, which is April. So we can't create a sampling frame for all the women that will come to the hospital this year because it's a future event, right? And it's not as if people just, it's a different thing when it's like a school environment. The school environment is a bit different because you have registered students. Students register at the beginning of a term, and then they come to school every day. So we can say that John is supposed to be in school next month or next week. Whether John comes to school or not is another issue, but he's registered to be in school. But unfortunately, that's not how hospitals work. People just wake up and walk into any hospital, right? So it's impossible for us to build a sampling frame based on future events. It has to be, there has to be some membership that defines individuals who are in that group. We can't do that in this particular context we're referring to. So a sampling frame is out of it in this case. So my original context was you do the study with a convenient sample, and then you go back. So we look at all the women who attended the hospital in the period that covered our study, which was the past 12 months. We look at their characteristics, we pull all of their records and look at their characteristics. Our study also took place over the past 12 months. So those periods overlap. If our sample was a representative sample of those women, we should find that the distribution of women in our sample should be similar to that in the entire frame, right? If we find that 50% of the women in our sample were, let's say, middle-aged compared to 80% in the sampling frame, it means that there's some non-response bias taking place, right? Because it means that maybe middle-aged women have differential responses compared to younger women or much older women, right? That signals that there's a problem. Now, how do we address it? Well, you have two options here. You can say, well, I'm just going to leave it as it is. I don't want unnecessary headache. Or you can say, well, I'm very adventurous, so I like pain. So I'm going to create weights. I'm going to create calibration weights that will force the sample to resemble the sampling frame. So those are your options at this point. But in this case, we cannot prospectively build a sampling frame for something where we cannot define membership. That will be impossible. I hope that explanation makes sense to you.
Yes, sir. It does. Just a further clarification. You gave an example of a sample frame working for a school because everybody is pre-registered. Now, I just want to draw an analogy with the pregnant women answer. Is it possible to go to that school if, for instance, the academic department is hostile? Can you go to the students themselves and do a census of all the students that you can find and use that as a sample frame?
So if you were to do a census, the question is, why would you want to do a census, right? Because sure, you can do a census. So first of all, let me answer that. Yes, you can do a census. But if you're going to do a census of a very large group of people, the question is why? Like, why would you want to do that? It's so inefficient. And this is not even a scientific question now. This is a question of logistics. If I told you that a sample is as good as the census without the cost of a census, so it's like, is it that you like to suffer? for lack of a better way of putting it, right? So that's a question that it raises, right? An examiner will just say, oh, is it that you like to suffer or what? Because a sample, if drawn at random, will give you valid inferences that represent the whole population, right? That is the whole crux of statistics and the field of probability theory, that yes, if we draw a simple random sample, it is as good as taking a census, right? And take note that the fact that you took a census does not mean that you have captured the parameter. because capturing a parameter is a hypothetical exercise. It assumes things that are not possible to fulfill. It assumes that you sample everybody, number one. Number two, there is absence of measurement bias. Everybody told the truth. Nobody told the lie. There were no errors in measurement. It is impossible. So even if you took the whole census, you still cannot estimate a parameter. So why bother? So just take a sample and just be fine. I hope you understand my.
It does, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay, great. All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week in class. Have a great weekend.
Thank you very much, Prof.
All right, thanks. Yeah, cheers. Bye.
So thanks, everyone. For Faraja, whose hand is still up, please, if it's possible, you can still preserve your question for next week. And as regards our recording, we will definitely send it to all our communities. So be sure to check it out. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the day.